Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is a video I have been planning for some time now, basically ever since I started uploading more regularly back in October. Essentially what I'm doing is going through the history of railways and engines on Sodor, as shown in the books. I'm only doing the books because, while I talked about in an earlier video what I count as canon, for that to work you have to accept that stories in the Brenner era don't actually happen at the place they are shown to. Therefore, trying to piece together a history of railways, including the Brenner era, would be next to impossible. So, the first railway on Sodor opened in 1806, called the Plateway, or simply the railroad, between Wardfell and Balladwell. However, there were no engines running this railway. They used horses to pull trucks uphill, and then used gravity for the trucks to roll down to Balladwell. This railway served the Crofton's Gate Mining Company, which had a copper mine at Wardfell, and the copper would be shipped out at Balladrin. Fast forward 44 years, and in 1850, a second railway was proposed, designed to link Barrow and Furness on the mainland with Sudbury, the capital of Sodor. While there was little interest on the mainland, there was plenty of enthusiasm from Sudrians, particularly in the north, and was promised a branch line would spurt off from Cronk going up to Peel Godred. In 1853, the railway was approved by Parliament, allowing construction to begin, with a single track being laid from Ballyhoo to Rolfs Castle, and it opened as the Sodor Mainland Railway. The Sodor Mainland Railway was operated by 3 engines, S&M numbers 1, 2 and 3. We meet number 2 in Skarloey's flashback in Very Old Engines, where Skarloey calls him Neil. In Victor Tanzig's series, he is given numbers 1 and 3 the names Clive and Matthew. However, no name has been given to either of these engines in any work by either Audrey. In 1863, improvements were called for on the railroad. It was decided to stop using horses and replace them with steam engines. It was originally intended for the line to be only used for minerals, like its predecessor, but plans were later changed. In 1865, the line opens, and is renamed Skarloey Railway as trains run between Crofton's Gate and Skarloey. 2 engines, Skarloey and Rheneas, arrive in that year. Also in 1865, the Sodor Mainland Railway was extended down to the fishing port of Kirkronan, hoping to start a steamer service from Kirkronan to Dublin. This project failed. However, with the opening of the Skarloey Railway in the same year, the 2 lines met at Crofton's Gate, and the Crofton's Gate Mining Company used Kirkronan for the shipment of ore, which was delivered to the harbour by the Sodor Mainland Railway. However, this railway kept meeting failures. Their tunnel through the Ballyhoo Ridge collapsed, preventing the railway from connecting to the main town on the eastern side of Sodor, Vickerstown. Because of this, trains only ran between Kirkronan and Ballyhoo, and, by 1870, the company was already on the verge of bankruptcy. In the same year, a new railway was opened. This was the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway, operating between Crosby and Sudbury, with a middle station of Wellsworth. It was run by 4 tank engines, none of which have been named. By 1872, the people of Peel Godred realised that the branch line promised to them by the Sodor Mainland Railway was not going to happen, and took it upon themselves to construct it. They initially planned to follow the route proposed by the S&M, but instead decided to avoid it, as it would mean having a junction with the S&M. This led to the construction of the Mid-Sodor Railway, which would later open in the year 1880, the same year that Duke arrived on Sodor to operate the Mid-Sodor Railway. And in 1879, there were more problems for the Sodor Mainland Railway, as their attempts at connecting Sodor to the mainland via a bridge at Vickerstown failed, and all further bridge building attempts were indefinitely shelved. This, ironically, means that the Sodor and Mainland Railway never reached the mainland. 3 years later, in 1883, a fifth railway was formed. This was the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway, running between Elsbridge and Knapford via Tory Wreck. This railway opened 2 years later, in 1885. In 1897, yet another railway begins construction. This is the Coldey Fell Railway, operating through the mountains. At the turn of the 20th century, things are moving fast in 4 of the 6 railways on Sodor. In 1900, the Coldey Fell Railway opened, and 5 engines, Godred, Ernest, Wilfrid, Coldey and Shane Dooney, arrive on Sodor to run it. It is in the same year that Godred had his accident and was later scrapped. The following year, the Coldey Fell Railway reopened after being upgraded following Godred's accident. Also in 1901, after being on the verge of bankruptcy for 30 years, the Sodor and Mainland Railway finally closes, with all 3 of its engines being scrapped. However, the company continued to exist for another 13 years. When the Walworth and Sudbury Railway opened, it hoped to use Sudbury as a harbour. However, blown-up masonry from Sudbury Castle had created a bar preventing its use by shipping except for the very smallest route. All attempts at dredging would prove to be costly failures, which resulted in the railway extending south along the coast to Brendam in the early 1900s, hoping to establish a harbour there. Back on the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway, the harbour they had opened in Knapford proved to be a disappointment. Needed constant dredging, and by 1905, the cost had become prohibitive. A.W. Dry recommended that the mining company abandon the harbour in favour of extending the line around the coastline to Tidmouth. The company had been using horses up to this point, but decided they were no longer suitable. A young engineer at A.W. Dry, called Mr. Topham Hatt, was tasked to build light locomotives in their place. These engines were the coffee pots, and were built in 1905. The Walworth and Sudbury Railway were continuing their efforts to build a harbour at Brendam. He had successfully built jetties there, which were greatly appreciated by local fishermen. But attempts at establishing a port were unsuccessful, and the project was abandoned in 1909. The previous year, in 1908, the coastal section of the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway up to Tidmouth was destroyed by a severe storm. The disruption of the tramway led to severe unemployment. A.W. Dry helped arrange a loan from the Treasury to put miners back into work by cutting a tunnel directly to Tidmouth, which was overseen by Topham Hatt, with the first train coming through in July 1910. The railway was reopened as the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge Light Railway. In 1912, it was decided that the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge Light Railway and the Walworth and Sudbury Railway would combine to form the Tidmouth, Walworth and Sudbury Railway. 2 years later, the Sodor and Mainland Railway became part of this plan, and it became the North Western Railway. Lord Harwick was appointed as chairman, and Mr. Topham Hatt was appointed as the chief mechanical engineer, and North Western Railway began operating in 1915. The construction work needed to connect the 3 railways was significant. The NWR put a single tunnel through the Ballyhoo Ridge, allowing it to extend to Bickerstown. A rolling lift bridge designed by Topham Hatt was built across the Walney Channel, finally connecting Sodor with the mainland, with repair shops being established at Croghan's Gate, and many of the routes of former railways were converted from single track to double track, and stations at Marron, Kildane, Kelsport Road and Bickerstown were built, along with a station at Norranby for the Norranby branch line. In 1916, the government ordered a single-track extension of the main line up to Arlesborough. This was for strategic reasons, as the British government were wary of a potential attack from Ireland. The line was originally intended to reach Harwick, with armoured trains supposed to patrol the west coast of the island, but by the time Arlesborough was reached, the immediate threat had passed and the further extension was dropped. When the NWR opened, the only engines available to work were the coffee pot engines from the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge Light Railway, and the 4 tank engines from the Walworth and Sudbury Railway. After the railways were combined, the coffee pots were relegated to only operating between Knapford and Elsbridge. Between 1924 and 25, the branch line was extended to Farquhar and its quarry, but it was decided that the engines weren't adequate and Thomas was transferred to take charge of the branch line. The coffee pots continued to serve as backup, though the limiting braking abilities on the steep quarry tramway sometimes caused the heavy stone trains to run out of control. It is unknown when the coffee pots were withdrawn from service, with the events not being well documented. In the letter written by the Farquhar station master, it is revealed that one was still operating during the events where Thomas and his crew were fined for illegally operating on the tramroad extension. Their final retirement and scrapping date is unknown, but is likely to be very shortly after 1951, as when Toby arrived, the need for backup engines was reduced. As for the Wellsworth and Sudbury tank engines, nothing is known about them after 1914. However, it is assumed that they were scrapped. Throughout the First World War, the NWR borrowed locomotives and rolling stock from the Midland and Furness companies, including Edward, a mixed traffic engine built in 1896, and Thomas, a tank engine from the LB and SCR, built in 1915. No one fully knows how Thomas arrived on Sodor. Most people say it was because of a wartime mix-up. His driver and fireman got along well with the local people and married Sudbury women. By 1920, neither wanted to leave the island or Thomas. During an inquiry, Topham Hatt found out that the LB and CSR had written off Thomas as being lost on war service. Rather than face complications resulting from a change in their books, the LB and SCR quietly sold Thomas to the North Western Railway for a quote-unquote nominal sum. By 1921, most of the locomotives borrowed from the NWR had to be returned, and replacements needed to be found. However, as the First World War had ended, and the military value of the NWR was over, government support was withdrawn. This resulted in a locomotive crisis, and Mr. Topham Hatt, now the director, was placed in charge of finding new motive power. In 1922, he attempted to buy Robinson Atlantic, but ended up with Henry, a result of stolen plans, an engine riddled with problems. And in 1923, he bought Gordon and James, both experimental prototypes, with Gordon arriving in 1923, but James not arriving until 1925. Also in 1923, 87546 and 98462 arrive on Sodor and are shortly sent packing. Later that year, the Peel Godfrey branch was built, with a new station opening at Abbey. This branch line resulted in a decrease in traffic for the mid-Sodor. In 1925, the NWR starts running trains to Barrow and Furness, the last stop on the mainland before Sodor. In the same year, the section of the Teignmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge light railway between Knapford and Elsbridge is reopened, with the line extending to the Farquhar, and Thomas taking charge of this line. New stations are built at Dryall, Troyrick and Elsbridge, and the headquarters of the railway was moved from Vickerstown to Teignmouth. 5 years later, in 1930, Henry, Gordon and James go on strike, and the Fat Controller purchases Percy to act as the Teignmouth station pilot. 5 years later again, in 1935, Henry has his incident with the Flying Kipper, and is sent to crew for a rebuild. In 1936, Sir Topham Hatt is promoted from General Manager to Managing Director. The mountain section of the Mid-Sodor Railway is also closed in this year. After the Second World War, in 1947, the Mid-Sodor Railway and the Teignmouth to Aylesbury branch of the North Western are closed. Stewart and Vulcan are purchased by the aluminium works at Peel Godred for an expansion project, and Duke is left abandoned in his shed. In the same year, Bertie and Terence arrive on Sodor. The following year, in 1948, British Railways is formed from the old LNER, the LMS, the SR and the GWR. The North Western Railway is now officially the North Western Region of British Railways. Also in 1948, the old route of the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway is reopened as the branch line of the North Western Railway, and Edward takes charge of this line. This is the Brendan branch, or Edward's branch line. Bull and Ben are built and arrive on Sodor in the same year. In 1951, Toby and Henrietta arrive on Sodor. The following year, Trevor is saved from scrap by Edward and the Vicar of Wellsworth. Also in 1952, Falcon and Stewart are purchased by the Skarloey Railway and are renamed to Handel and Peter Sam, and Renaissance and Skarloey are both overhauled. In 1953, Harold arrived on Sodor, and Queen Elizabeth II visited. The following year, in 1954, Stubborn Hat II becomes the Fat Controller, taking over from his father. The following year, in 1955, Duck arrived on Sodor and became the station pilot for Teignmouth, and Percy was permanently allocated to Thomas's branch line. In 1956, Stubborn Hat I died. Knapford Junction was moved from south to north of the River Ells. Gordon gets to finish London, where he gets upset that he arrived at St Pancras and not King's Cross, and then the 8 famous engines of the North Western Railway all get to go visit London to prove to everyone that the engines in the books are real. In 1957, City of Truro visits Sodor, leading to Gordon losing his dome. In the same year, Diesel arrives on Sodor, and is soon sent packing. Also in 1957, Rusty arrives on Sodor. In the following year, Peter Sam had his accident with some slate trucks at the quarry, and Scarlow returns from being mended. In 1959, Donald and Douglas arrive on Sodor. The following year, Thomas crashed into the station master's house, and Daisy comes as a temporary replacement, and later stays on Sodor when Thomas comes back. In the same year, the Bluebell Railway in England is established. In 1961, the electric engines that run the Pure Godred branch line arrive on Sodor. Peter Sam is also given his special funnel, and Sir Handel is given his new wheels, and Rheneas returns to the Scarlowy Railway. In 1962, Mavis, Lord Harry, Adoric and Eric all arrive on Sodor. In the same year, Stepney made his visit to Sodor. In 1963, Coldie returns to the Coldie-Pearl Railway. Lord Harry is renamed Patrick, and the Lakeside Loop Line extension on the Scarlowy Railway begins construction. In 1964, the Teignmouth to Islesborough branch is rebuilt, with a new station being built at Holtra. In 1965, Shane Dooney returns to the Coldie-Pearl Railway. The 100th anniversary of the Talyllyn and Scarlowy Railways are celebrated, and although Scarlowy was officially the previous year, Scarlowy and Rheneas' 100th birthdays are also celebrated. In the same year, the Loop Line extension at Lakeside is opened on the Scarlowy Railway, and Boca arrives on the North Western Railway. In 1967, Blister 1 and Blister 2 arrive on Sodor for the construction of the Arlesdale Railway. Later that year, Rex, Mike and Bert arrive on Sodor to service the Arlesdale Railway. Also in 1967, the Flying Scotsman visits Sodor, as do Diesels 199 and 7101, with D199 quickly being sent packing and 7101 being renamed Bear. The Teignmouth branch is reopened and is serviced by Duck, and Douglas rescues Oliver, Isabel and Toad, and Oliver works on the Aylesbury branch, which has been given the nickname the Little Western. Also in 1967, Frank arrives on Sodor and works on the Arlesdale Railway. In 1968, SC Ruffy, also known as Scruffy, is pulled apart by Oliver. Oldie also arrives on Sodor and is shortly turned into a hen house. And sadly, steam traction officially ends on British Railways. The following year, in 1969, Sigrid of Arlesdale is built and arrives on Sodor to work the Arlesdale Railway. In the same year, Duke is discovered by Mr. Fergus Duncan, the Reverend W. Audrey, and the Reverend Teddy Boston. In 1976, Jock is built to work on the Arlesdale Railway. In 1984, Sir Topham Hatt III becomes the third Fat Controller. In 1990, after privatisation, the name North Western Railway becomes official. In 1997, Sir Topham Hatt II died. And finally, in 2011, Pip and Emma are purchased by the North Western Railway for the Fat Controller, retiring Gordon from the Express and replacing him with Pip and Emma. And that is the complete history of the railways and engines on Sodor, as per the Railway series. Thanks for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. You can follow me on Instagram by clicking on the link in the description, but that's all for today. I will see you next week.